I am curious about this idea of there not being any damage. I mean, even if Jay Powell isn't removed prior to his term, the idea that we've planted this seed, or at least the White House has planted this seed, that somehow he's incompetent, somehow that his policy choices have somehow been a mistake, and that we're going to right that, not necessarily through data, but simply by picking somebody that we think is ideologically aligned with the president's view, does that not in and of itself change the expectations in the market, and maybe not for the better?
I mean, sure. What the Fed does in a given month, even what the Fed does between now and May, is a lot less important than what people think the Fed may do in the next few years. And so if we have a now quite strong possibility, even if we don't think that Trump will manage to or nerve himself up to fire Powell now, if we think that the Fed chair down the pike is going to be somebody, it's not even ideologically aligned with the White House, there's going to be somebody who basically takes his orders from the White House. I mean, that's a very different thing. It's one thing to have somebody who's hawkish or dovish or whatever, but what we really are looking at, I mean, I had a Substack, hawks, doves, and lapdogs. If we're going to have a Fed chair who is basically just taking instructions from President Trump, that's got to be really damaging to credibility.
It gets to this idea, though, too, of this idea of exactly where rates should be, and more importantly, what should be factored into the decision to move rates, whether it's up or down. And I know the Fed will tell you, look, we're just looking at the data here. But when you think about the fiscal dominance that seems to be emerging under this administration, I do wonder if the traditional metrics that we use to determine where rates maybe should go might actually be somewhat muted, given how much issuance is coming out of the Treasury, how much stimulus is coming out of Congress.
Well, what we do know is that Trump has a view of interest rates. Aside from he says that rates should be 300 basis points lower than they are now. And that's the kind of cut that you only do in the face of an economic emergency. But Trump says the economy is doing great, so he doesn't think that we actually have an emergency. He seems to think that the economy has been a good boy and deserves a rate cut. It's kind of like an achievement prize. And that bears no resemblance to any monetary philosophy that I've heard of. And yeah, fiscal dominance, the idea that I'm not sure that there is something he really wants, but I think a lot of it's just confused. But to the extent that there is something, there does seem to be growing pressure to de facto monetize budget deficits.
Yeah, well, as he put it,
catastrophic.
Yeah, he's given very different reasons for why he wants Jay Powell to go, from not cutting interest rates to not helping the government save money to spending too much money on the Fed headquarter renovations. Separate from the politics and this pressure campaign, does President Trump have a point in saying that the Fed funds rate is too high relative to inflation, relative to GDP, relative to the rest of the world?
No, I mean, if you were looking at the actual hard data, we have fairly low, more or less full employment. We have inflation slightly above the Fed's target, not a lot, but above the Fed's target. That would be a case for basically staying where you are. So any pronouncements about what the rate should do would be about what you think is going to happen next. And maybe the economy is going to slow down, although it's been pretty robust. We do know that at least headline, whatever Trump and people may say, headline inflation is going to rise at least for a while because of the tariffs. Now, we don't know whether that's going to be persistent or not, but surely, if you're thinking about the risks, at best, they're two-sided. There's nothing compelling in the data, nothing compelling even what we know about the near future that would say that you should be having significant rate cuts. I mean, I understand that if you think that inflation is going to continue to decline after some blip, then we might be cutting rates, but it's not there yet.
Well, how much of Fed reluctance to cut rates, to resume rate cuts, really, is tied to the fact that it got things wrong after COVID, insisting that inflation that we saw was transitory and then letting the economy run too hot for too long and not hiking rates sooner. And then when it did, it had to hike it by a lot.
Well, I mean, in general, the Fed is, look, when people say the Fed got it wrong, I always want to say compared to who? Right? Who were the people who really were? And yeah, you can find some people who gave better advice, but then you look and you find out that they gave bad advice on 10 other issues. And I don't think, really, if you applied a Taylor rule or something like that to the current situation, it would say leave rates where they are or maybe increase them. Now, maybe we can make some judgment calls about that. But I think that a lot of what's happening is that I don't think the Fed is afraid of making the mistakes of 2021, 2022 again. I think the Fed is afraid that we may, we have an economy that is still running fairly hot by normal standards. We do not seem to be getting continuing disinflation the way we were through most of 2024. Again, where is the compelling case for a rate cut in all of that?
Professor, a little bit earlier today, former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh, one of the names that has been talked about as a potential replacement for Powell, he gave an interview on a competing network. And he talked about this idea of revisiting the Fed's framework, the idea that there needed to be sort of a new accord between the Treasury and the Fed, or the relationship between the Treasury and Fed, similar to what was done back in 1951, which actually gave the Fed greater independence. Now, he didn't really clarify if he wanted to do that in a way that would give the Treasury more control, but I am curious about your view of the interconnectedness between what the Fed does and what the Treasury does, and how those two should coexist.
Well, the reason that we have a tradition that's really no more than that, but a tradition of Fed independence, is that we generally don't. The trouble with monetary policy is it's too easy. It's so easy to just cut rates, and the temptation for a politician to cut rates for short-term political gain is just too large. So we, once upon a time we had the gold standard. There are lots of reasons why that was a bad idea, but an independent central bank in many ways serves the same purpose of not allowing politicians to play games with money for their own short-term political advantage. And can you tell me anything that would make that a less compelling argument now? I mean, even if you thought that maybe the president, a president, might not be someone you worry about exerting undue influence, you probably wouldn't attach Donald Trump to that proposition. It's hard to think of anybody in U.S. political history who you would be more concerned about abusing political influence over the Fed. So no, I mean, Warsh is very vague about this, but that's actually kind of his hallmark. He says things that sound very impressive, and but to try to figure out what it was he actually said, that is kind of a Warsh thing.
Is there anyone out there that you would want to see in that seat? I mean, assuming that one way or the other Powell's gone by 2026, May of 2026, if it's not the names being bandied about, the Warshes, the Hassetts, Wallers, even Bessent, is there anyone out there that you look to and think this person would be perfect?
Oh, I think there's just lots of people. I mean, almost any. If you think it has to be a Wall Street guy, any reasonable Wall Street guy will do. I think, there's. We've actually had some pretty good academic economists in that role. Bernanke, Yellen, maybe we're not doing that anymore. But I don't, the Fed we're not in times. There have been times when you really needed heroic leadership, when you needed a Bernanke or a Draghi. I don't think we're in that kind of time. We just need somebody sensible. And there's a long list of reasonable, sensible people. I don't have a particular preference, except that Waller would be I don't think Waller has a chance because he is a sensible, reasonable guy. And I think that's disqualifying from the point of view of the Trump administration. But everybody else on the list is kind of, I want to do the gesture because it is really, we're talking about the Fed becoming just an arm of the White House political operation.
Paul, as we end this conversation, you talk about reasonable and sensible. The president has resumed tariffs, or at least tariff threats, on different countries, including those who thought that they were making progress in bilateral trade talks. Your take is there really is no strategy from the president when it comes to tariffs. So what's the reasonable, sensible approach for those countries when they do negotiate? How do they do that?
Well, it's a really hard thing because the trouble is Trump is making demands for concessions when there's nothing to concede. The European Union has a 1% tariff on U.S. manufactured goods entering the EU. What are they going to do? Cut that to zero? Is that going to make a difference? So what the only strategy that might work is finding something meaningless but impressive sounding so that Trump can declare victory and pull out. And I have no expertise in how you do that. But, this is really not about substance. This is all about trying to give the only thing that either you get confrontational, as the Chinese have, or you look for a way to make Trump feel good while not actually doing much.